Welcome back to Lecture 2. This is Part 2 of 4, The Golden Age of Silent Film. The two main topics we're going to be talking about in today's lecture are the early role of minorities in cinema and great comedians of the silent era. A lot of people don't know this, but in the very beginning of the motion picture industry, women played key roles. Particularly Alice Guy Blanchet was important to film history. She started out as a secretary to Leon Gomo, but wound up directing well over 300 films. She was one of the first directors to work with color and synchronous sound before 1910. American Lois Weber started with Gomo as an actress, but she graduated to the director's chair pretty quickly. In 1916, she became Universal Studios' highest paid director. She was the first woman to be granted membership into the Motion Picture Directors Association, and John Ford worked as one of her assistants. Minorities had a very tough time during the studio era, particularly African Americans. In the wake of Birth of a Nation, the African American community became incensed and felt the need to answer cinematically and strongly to the racism of Birth of a Nation. So a new company was formed. It was called the Lincoln Film Corporation. But from the beginning, Lincoln Film had a rough time. Their biggest problem wasn't that they didn't have sufficient capital, but the largest problem was rather that they could not find technicians within the African American community. Now, as you know, it takes a great deal of technological expertise to make a motion picture, and they just simply couldn't find people within the community. So they were forced to hire third-rate white technicians, directors, cinematographers, editors, basically people who weren't considered employable within the Hollywood studio system for one reason or another. Some of them had severe health problems, alcoholics, drug addiction, you name it. These people were not the best, not the cream of the crop, not the best and the brightest. So from the beginning, Lincoln Films looked kind of primitive and rough compared to movies being produced by mainstream Hollywood studios. Nonetheless, they learned of a golden opportunity. This man, Oscar Micheaux, had written a book called The Homesteader, and The Homesteader had made a lot of money. It had been widely read by both black and white readers. Probably the white readers read it because they didn't realize that Micheaux was black and it was a good book, so they read it anyway. At any rate, Lincoln Film entered into negotiations for the story, but Oscar Micheaux said, "I'll just give you the story, but you have to let me direct. I've seen what your work looks like, and I'm not going to let you do this to The Homesteader." And they kind of laughed at him and said, "You don't know the first thing about making a movie." And the bottom line is they weren't able to come to terms, but Micheaux walked out of there with the idea that he could direct this film. He simply used the profits he made from the book and make a feature-length movie out of it, and that is exactly what he did in 1919. The Homesteader became the first feature-length film to be produced by an African American. Micheaux became the top producer of his day in the field of race films. Now, this is what they're still referred to. Reason being is they played to black-only audiences, and most of the theaters were in the industrialized big northern cities like Detroit and Cleveland, Chicago, and in the rural areas in the Deep South. Micheaux used the money and used his reputation to get financing and continued to produce movies all through this era. But when talking pictures moved into the industry and became the norm in mainstream Hollywood, Micheaux was the only producer, the only African-American producer who was able to continue and make the leap into talking pictures. Pretty amazing feat. So why isn't Micheaux better known to contemporary audiences today? Well, the short answer is that Micheaux was a racist. Now, not the kind of racist you're probably thinking of, because Micheaux believed that dark-skinned black people were inferior to lighter-skinned. And it became very, very pronounced in his talking pictures. Not so easy to see, not so apparent in the silent movies that he was making earlier. But this cost him dearly. He gradually lost the support of the African American community at large, and this is probably why he's not better remembered today. This era also saw the rise of the first true international superstar, and of course that person was Charlie Chaplin. Now, this kind of fame prior to Charlie Chaplin was reserved for generals and great politicians, and there had never been a true international star before. Let me play you a little clip to give you some background on Charlie Chaplin and his character of the Tramp.
Well, at one time, people didn't say, let's go to the movies. They said, let's go see Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was the movies.
Chaplin became the most famous man in the world in 1 year. It was the beginning of movie merchandising. There were Charlie Chaplin dolls, Charlie Chaplin toys, Charlie Chaplin comic strips, Charlie Chaplin songs and sheet music sold everywhere. It was fame, unprecedented fame.
Chaplin pretty much had a monopoly on the comedy field. And if theater owners couldn't get Chaplin films because they had contracts with different distributors, then they wanted Chaplin knockoffs. And so people produced Chaplin imitations. People went and pretended they were Charlie Chaplin when it's quite obvious they're not. When you see Chaplin, you know you're seeing a one-of-a-kind artist.
Chaplin, though, had a lot of competition, as you might imagine. Probably the best known was Buster Keaton, and Buster Keaton was famous for being the great stone face.
Keaton was a still thing in a crazy world, you know. The world was crazy around Keaton, and he just kind of sat there and kind of watched it go by.
Keaton was way ahead of his time. And I think that's why his comedies stand up so well now.
Well, I was born with a tent show on a one-night stand in Kansas, and it was called the Keaton Houdini Medicine Show Company. Now, that's Harry Houdini, the handcuff king. He was the doctor and trickster of the outfit. My old man was the entertainer and comic. And when I was 6 months old, we're in some little town, small hotel, and I fell down a full flight of stairs. I sat up, shook my head, and shook it off, and didn't cry. And Houdini says, that was sure a buster. My father said, well, that would be a good name for him.
The third acknowledged genius of the silent era was this man, Harold Lloyd. Harold Lloyd was also known as the king of the thrill comedy. Now, he didn't have a character like Chaplin or Keaton. Instead, he just kind of played the average boy who, against incredible odds, gets the girl and becomes a success in life. His best remembered film is Safety Last, and also has one of his most exciting thrill comedy sequences in it. That's the real thing. No rear projection, no CGI. Harold Lloyd was really up there. And this concludes lecture 2, part 2 of 4.